Hello, my name is Michael Dodson, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Southern Mississippi in the Center for STEM Education. And I'd like to talk to you about botany in Mississippi gardens. Botany, in basic terms, is just the study of plants. It is where we talk about life cycles, we learn about structures, growth patterns, classification, which is how things are related. This is a little different than horticulture, which is more focused on maybe how to grow plants better or increase their yield. So we're looking at really the basic understanding of what makes a plant a plant. And so in this presentation, I would like to talk to you about what makes a plant versus things that are maybe considered unwanted in our gardens that we sometimes call weeds. Now, I do want to give a disclaimer that while I may mention that some plants are edible, please do not eat any plant that you are not 100% sure about its identity and what part of the plant it is that you should eat and what and when from that plant you should eat as well. Also, I may mention that some plants are medicinal. I am not recommending that you use these plants without training or without medical supervision potentially, because there can be interactions with these natural medicines and your prescription medicines. So I put this disclaimer in. I will mention these things, but I'm not advocating that you necessarily do this without proper training. I will also try to use common names and scientific names and focus on scientific names because understanding that specific scientific name helps us to know exactly what plant we're talking about versus some common names where we have the same common name for multiple species and it creates confusion. So we will use scientific names here as best we can. So a question that I get asked all the time is this a weed or is this a plant? And this is a common question with an underlying misconception. All plants that we consider weeds are actually still plants. So is this a weed or a plant? Doesn't really ask the question that you mean to ask. What's being asked is this plant matter? Does this plant have importance? And so that depends on the person in your perspective. On the left, we have violet wood sorrel, Oxalis violacea. And when it is considered in some people's yards as a weed, a problem species, they will mow it down or try to remove it. People don't like it sometimes. Then it would be considered a weed for that person, but it's still a plant. And it has positive aspects for a lot of other people. On the right, we have broadleaf plantain, Plantago major, and it's a non-native species that is sometimes considered kind of weedy, but it also has benefits depending on how you look at the plant. It's all about our perspective. But in all cases, they are plants. Weeds are only weeds if you want them to be. If they are misunderstood, not where you want them to be, or causing problems that are specific to you, you might consider them a weed, but that doesn't mean that everyone does. One plant that has this problem is the greenbrier, sometimes called catbrier, but also the scientific name is smilax. And there are multiple species, but they have a lot of benefit for deer. They are edible by humans if you eat the part that's new growth and that breaks off easily. But they're very good barriers. They can actually be grown in kind of like a nice little fencing area if you really wanted to train your vines to do that. It's a very nice climbing evergreen with interesting berries, which I'll show you in a moment. Now, it does spread easily and it has thorns, and I see why people have problems with it. But considering that it's a native plant and it's actually really useful for a lot of wildlife, we might consider that there's ways that we can live with this plant in certain places, remove it from some, but leave it in others so that it can benefit our ecosystem. There are beautiful berries. They are evergreen plants. They might lose their leaves in the winter, but they a lot of times have green stems in the winter. So they're evergreen. They have beautiful berries. These berries are useful for wildlife. There's a lot of benefit. So should we consider this a weed? I don't think so. In the right place, it is most definitely a useful plant, and it is definitely part of our ecosystem of Mississippi. Now, here we have dandelions. We have the common dandelion, Taraxacum officinale. It's a non-native species. It has edible properties. It can be good for some pollinators like the honeybee from Europe, which is also a non-native species. And on the right, we have a common dwarf dandelion, which is a native species, um, and also has some edible properties and attracts pollinators. Now, we will talk about the difference between non-native and native coming up. I would advocate for as much possible use native plants, and we'll talk about why. Plants that are from your area help to increase the biodiversity, not just of other plants, but of insects, birds, mammals, a lot of other species, including even fungi and some bacteria. They can help to reduce water consumption in your gardens if you're working with native plants because they don't have to be watered as much as non-native plants. They actually have adapted to the Mississippi climate. That's not true for every species, of course, but for a lot, they can handle the ups and downs of our climate. You don't have to use as many herbicides or pesticides to maintain these plants. They don't have these special needs sometimes, and they can actually be nice companion plants for your fruiting plants that you might be growing. They can bring in pollinators, native pollinators to our plants. Now, if you're interested in growing with native plants, you can use native plant nurseries that do exist and are found in Mississippi. If you want to know more about how to identify what is native and non-native, you can actually look at the flora of the southeastern United States. There's a website for this. There's an app that you can get. You can even download free PDFs, and you can actually um, narrow the PDFs down to just for Mississippi. Other plants that are sometimes considered weeds, the violets, but these are native plants that are like the common blue violet, Viola sororia, but they're actually edible. They make very nice lawn covers. They can replace your grass. They handle being mowed. They don't get very tall, and they stay green. And a lot of times they have flowers for long into the growing season. Now, here might be a plant that you don't want in your yard. You might not want it exactly in your garden, but in the right place, it's a wonderful plant. This is the berries and briars that are going to be the blackberries and related species. They have amazing berries. This is dewberry, Rubus trivialis, uh, blooming in early spring, and in late spring, you get fruit of wonderful fruit that tastes fantastic. You can actually use this plant as like a draping of down a wall. I use this in my own yard um, where I have dirt ledges and then it has a concrete wall and I use it to kind of have nice green coverings to go down that wall. But that also means I've got really easy picking for blackberries. Many of these are native in our area and they're very useful. If you're using a dewberry, it will do this draping. Larger blackberries are going to cane, so you might have to train them or tie them up so they don't take over more space. Claytonia virginica, spring beauty, is also great for early pollinators that are timed pretty well with the insects that are coming out of winter. They make a great lawn cover. They can help along with violets to replace a large portion of your lawn, your grass, because grasses that we use for our lawns are non-native. And the native grasses that we do have in Mississippi, many of them are not the best for lawns. So if we can transition some of our lawns or even areas of our lawns away from grass, we can increase the biodiversity for those areas, making it better for birds, insects, and so many other things that make our yards so intriguing for us. Wild onions are something you might find. They are edible, of course. They don't cause any problems in your yards. And if you don't mow them down, they can eventually flower, and they're also kind of pretty when they do this. And here we've got a native food source for ourselves and other things. Spiderwort is another native plant that can be edible for us. It doesn't cause any harm in your lawn, except that it does spread easily. And that can be both a good thing or a bad thing. It handles our climate very well. And if you don't mow it, you get these nice kind of bushy areas of growth. Some people don't like how they spread, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily a weed. If they're in the right place at the right time, then they are a very useful plant. One, they bring in pollinators. Um, they can bring in insects to help with your other plants. And if you don't like it, you can mow them down and they come back pretty easily. So they are actually a nice addition to yards. So what makes a non-native plant different? Non-native plants are foreign plants that have been introduced into our ecosystem from other places. Many of the ones in Mississippi are actually from temperate climates like Europe and East Asia. There's no way to tell just by looking if a plant is non-native or native unless you actually know the species. One of the ways to do this is to use that flora of the southeastern United States. Or you can use apps like iNaturalist or Seek, which is also through iNaturalist, to help you make these determinations a little more quickly. Now, another thing that we have to talk about is the words invasive versus aggressive. When we talk about non-native species, the word invasive sometimes comes up. And this has a very specific ecological definition for non-native plants that actually cause harm to the local ecosystems that they are newly introduced to. Now, this is different than native plants. Native plants can't be invasive, but they can be aggressive. They can be easy spreaders, and they can have a weedy kind of growth, but they can't be invasive as by definition because they are not non-native. So, can native plants be aggressive more than you want? Absolutely. And we can control those when we need, but we don't want to use the term invasive. Invasiveness can also be something that people don't realize as it can show up later in its time in a new area. For example, kudzu and Japanese knotweed are two major invasives in the eastern United States. We don't do as much Japanese knotweed in Mississippi, um, but as an invasive species biologist, that is one that I've studied. But both of those were introduced in the 1800s, and it took 100, 150 years before they really started to take over the areas to the point where they really, really, really caused damage. Did they do this before? Probably in small amounts, but they eventually reached a critical mass to be able to really cover a lot of areas and wipe out other plants because they shade them, take away their nutrients, and take over their areas. This is why we're careful with the word invasive versus aggressive. Invasive for non-native plants that can really destroy habitats, and aggressive plants which, while they might be able to spread very easily and take over areas, in the right places, they do not destroy their ecosystems. So native plants cannot be invasive in their home ranges, but they can be aggressive, and that's what we might sometimes call weeds. But they're still plants that in the right place are beneficial. Now, here are some non-native plants that you might see common that spread and are very aggressive in their areas. While they don't last long, they may not cause as much damage as other things like kudzu. They can spread and take over, but you can eat them. They are edible. You can make teas from them. And one way to tell things that are in the mint family, many mints and relatives have square stems. So henbit, Lamium emploxicale, purple dead nettle, Lamium purpureum, are something that you might come across. They're beautiful in the spring. They don't last as long, but they can take over an area. Um, some are worse invasives than others. These seem to be a little bit less than many. Now, these are non-native legumes. There are some benefits to them, but I'm not suggesting that you plant them uh, for these benefits, but you might be able to make use of them if you already have them. For example, common vetch, Vicia sativa, smooth tare, which is another vetch, Vicia tetrasperma, and red clover. All of these are legume family plants, as is black medic, Medicago, lupulina, white clover, Trifolium repens. These are all non-native. We have some native legume families, so maybe we can transition them over. They are many times edible, but what's amazing about many groups within the legume family is that they are nitrogen fixers and they can actually be used to put nitrogen back into the soil, sometimes as cover crops. I would suggest let's look for native versions of these. The good thing is they come in spring and they don't usually last too far into at least not in great numbers, into the summer, but they can shade out native plants. There are some benefits where pollinators use them, and they can also help bring birds. Are they weeds? I wouldn't call them weeds. They have utility, but are they something that I would plant on purpose? Being non-native, I would not. Sometimes you can see tiny flowers. Sometimes in my garden, we don't really pay attention to the tiny flowers, and we think of things as weeds just because they're not the things we planted there. But we have early pollinators that visit these small flowers. Now, there are native and non-native versions of these. For example, the speedwell here, Veronica pallida, is a non-native. We do have some native speedwells in North America. Carolina cranesbill is a small geranium, Geranium carolinianum. Bluets, another native, Houstonia cerulea. Sometimes when we're down on our knees working in our garden, it might be good to pay attention to these tiny flowers and leave them space when they are native. We might see chickweed early in the spring. It's also an edible plant, Serasium glomeratum. This is one of a number of chickweeds that we have. There are some native chickweeds, so some of them are native, some of them are not, but most of the ones you're going to see are non-native, as is the field madder that we see here blooming, which can be really beautiful up close, but you might not want to keep it there. So enjoy it when you see it, remove it when you can. Plantago species like Plantago lanceolata, the narrowleaf plantain on the left, and broadleaf plantain, Plantago major on the right, are both non-native. Um, Again, there are some native species in North America, but these are really common. They have some edible and medicinal uses. I'll let you look those up. But are they weeds? A lot of people consider them to be weeds. But again, weeds are just plants that are misunderstood in the wrong place or are not exactly um, what you're looking for in an area. So here, um, these are ones that I wouldn't necessarily plant on purpose because they're non-native, but they have their uses if they are there. Virginia creeper and poison ivy are native plants that are really useful. They can be confused with each other sometimes. You'll hear the leaves of three, let it be. On the right, it's actually not three leaves, it's three leaflets. These are three leaflets that actually are one leaf. And on the right, Virginia creeper usually has five leaflets that make up one leaf. And so these plants are useful for birds. Birds love their fruit. They are not invasive, but they do spread easily. So sometimes they're very aggressive and you want to remove them from certain places. Virginia creeper can take over parts of houses, but in different parts of the United States and even in England for sure, it gets used as a beautiful plant that turns red in the fall. So this is a native one that we can make use of in our habitats if we put it in the right place and try to keep it under control. I have seen these in Nebraska growing along chain link fences, planted there on purpose. Now, eastern poison ivy might not be something that we plant on purpose, but we shouldn't remove it from every habitat that we see. We don't need to go through the forest and kill every one because they are very essential for bird food, and they can be really necessary for certain times of the year for those birds to have food sources. And they are part of the native ecosystem. They fit within the ecosystem, as does Virginia creeper. And if allowed to have a space to live in, they have the benefit of actually benefit our natives spaces. My whole point here is to really help you to understand that biodiversity is a good thing. We don't have to remove everything that we consider a weed down to the bare soil in our gardens. They can be beneficial. Sometimes they can bring nutrients up so that our plants that we want can actually benefit from them. It can bring water. It can help to bring pollinators. They can shade the soil so that water doesn't um, evaporate from the soil. Bare soil is not the best. You have to maintain it a lot, and you can use some of our native plants to help maintain it in and around your preferred species. So increasing biodiversity is very, very helpful to our gardens and to our ecosystem. Using native plants over non-natives is hugely beneficial. We need to recognize that some pests are actually good to have. Things that we think of as insects that are not enjoyable, maybe wasps, are actually very good pollinators. Instead of getting rid of them, we leave them to their spaces where we can so that they can do their jobs and actually benefit us. We don't have to be as tidy in our gardens always. Sometimes leaving some leaves in areas and leaving stems, leaving upright habitat like taller plants are actually really beneficial for our native bee species to live in flower stems. Flower heads become bird food. They also become a place for the birds to stand to land on while it's needing a place if it doesn't have a tree around. We don't have to clear everything out, whether it's dead or alive. These things can be habitat and they can be beneficial to our gardens. So is this a weed or a plant? Well, weeds are plants. Weeds, if we want to use that term, are just misunderstood plants. So if we try to understand them, we'll see that most plants are not really weedy, but they might be non-native or native or aggressive, and we have to take the right steps as we learn those plants. As we know, gardening is good for you. And if we keep these things in mind, we can actually garden in a way that we can be a part of the ecosystem and benefit many more species beyond just ourselves. Sometimes you're even going to come across bigger things. In this case, small trees that will grow into larger trees. Oaks are beneficial. You might not want that in your garden, but you can transplant them to another space. They're good for deer. They're good for habitat. Uh, Black cherry, one that seems to be growing in lots of spots that you don't want it to, but they can be beautiful trees and they produce fruit that are edible by humans and by birds and other animals. So they're very useful in the ecosystem. Maybe we can plant them in good places as well, as opposed to choosing non-native trees. We plant the ones that show up in our gardens in places where they can be beneficial and save us money. Something else that you might see are going to be things like lichens here on the left. These are not really plants per se. They are photosynthetic, either cyanobacteria or algae that work and grow and live with a fungus, and they grow together. And they do not damage trees, so feel free to leave them alone. They are very useful plants in the ecosystem. They can have medicinal properties if you want to look at that. Don't take them off of trees though, because it's good for the tree. It doesn't harm the tree, and they're a little bit slow growing. On the right here, we've got some mosses. Sometimes they'll grow on trees, they'll grow in other places. They're actually really good at creating new habitat and turning things into good soil for us to use. So don't automatically take out plants that you don't understand. Maybe try to investigate them and see how they fit in the ecosystem. And then you might see that there's ways that they can fit into your garden as a part of a larger ecosystem. I hope that I've been helpful to you. I've tried to give you some resources with iNaturalist and Seek. Um, I've given some ideas of checking out the Flora of the Southeastern United States as an app or in the PDF format. Um, in the end, just remember that if you come across a plant that's a surprise in your garden, they can be beneficial for you. They could be beneficial for your garden, and they are more than likely, if they're native, to be beneficial to the ecosystem around you. I hope this has been beneficial and helpful to you as well. And if you have any questions, you will have a chance to be able to contact us later in the survey.
Hi there, my name is Samantha Bergeron. I'm with the University of Southern Mississippi, and today I'm going to talk with you about garden surprises. So these are things that you may not expect to see in your garden, but every now and then they'll pop up. So you might be looking at this title thinking herpetofaunal ecology, what is that? So herpetofaunal are just the organisms that fall under the umbrella of herpetology. So those are amphibians and reptiles. And the word herpeton, the root word for herpetology, actually comes from ancient Greek and means creeping thing. And ecology is just how organisms and their environment interact and work together. So we're going to talk about the ecology of your garden and how some of these reptiles in particular can help your garden. Just a warning, if you have an inherent fear of snakes or a very intense fear for any reptiles, this might be where you want to stop this presentation. We will talk about snakes near the end, and I will present this in a purely educational standpoint. Nothing is intended to cause you any undue stress or anxiety. So first, we're just going to talk about some of the reptiles, not all of the reptiles. Reptiles actually include your squamates, which are your lizards and snakes, which we are going to talk about, and then your turtles, crocodilians, and tuateras, which are a small lizard-like creature that live in New Zealand. And the word squama, just going back to the root words again, the word squama actually means scale. So squamates, your lizards, and snakes are scaly. And first, we're going to talk about lizards. And who doesn't love lizards, right? They are adorable. They're also very beneficial for your garden. So, most people think that lizards are reptiles with four legs and a nice long tail. And we'll talk about some that don't always meet those standards. The first one that most gardeners are very aware of are the green anoles or anoles. Both of those pronunciations are correct. This is the most common garden lizard that you'll see here in Mississippi. And they are very beneficial because they are insectivores and they are voracious hunters. They will jump and catch flying insects. They will eat creeping, crawling insects. Any of these insects that might be munching on the nice foliage in your garden, these lizards will help to protect your garden from those. We also have a second anole species here that's called a brown anole or a Cuban brown anole, and those are actually an invasive species. So if you see an anole that is brown and it has like a mohawk going down its back, that is the Cuban brown anole. Our green anoles can also be brown, as pictured here. The second lizard we're going to talk about are the skinks. And I do have reports of people that think that they have a snake in their garden when it's actually a skink. These move in kind of like a serpentine motion. And the small ones, like the little brown skink, have very small limbs and they do kind of resemble a snake, but these are in fact lizards. And these are great for your garden because one, they like to burrow through soil, which helps to aerate your soil, but they're burrowing through soil in search of their favorite food, which are beetle larvae and millipedes and centipedes. So they will eat those things and help to protect your garden from those pests. You'll also find their eggs pretty often because they lay their eggs in nice rich soil. So if you have a leftover bag of potting soil from last year that's been sitting under your garage or under your carport like I have, every now and then you'll find skink eggs in those. So those are those little white squishy eggs that you may find in your bags of potting soil. Those are from these. So this last lizard we're going to talk about, you might look at and say, that thing has no legs. It's obviously not a lizard, but it is in fact a lizard. This is a legless lizard. They're called glass lizards. We have three different types here in Mississippi. One of them, the mimic glass lizard, is a mimic of the slender, and so they look very similar. One is just smaller. Now they'll eat some of your larger invertebrates, so they like to eat larger grasshoppers. They can munch on snails or slugs. Sometimes they'll eat other reptiles, like maybe your small anoles, and they'll also eat very small rodents, like very small mice. These are great to have in your garden because they're great pest control. And they're called glass lizards because they can drop their tail, which is something called autotomy. And when they do drop their tail, it tends to shatter like glass, and that's where the name comes from. Some old folklore from this area is people used to believe that whenever the tail shattered, that it would grow into, that each little piece would grow into a new snake. So obviously that doesn't happen, but the tail autotomy is a defense mechanism that a lot of lizards employ so that whatever predator is messing with them will keep with the tail and their main body can get away and survive. So if you're looking at that, wondering, well, how do I know if it's a snake or a lizard? This is how you tell the difference. The picture on the left is the eastern glass lizard, and the picture on the right is a speckled king snake. So the first thing that you look for are eyelids. Lizards have eyelids, with the exception of some of the geckos that lick their eyes to stay moist. Those don't have eyelids, but the rest of the lizards do have eyelids. So if it winks at you, it's a lizard. The next thing that you look for are external ear openings. So if you look at the picture on the left, at the base of the jaw, there is a hole that is an external ear, so the lizards can hear you. That does not mean that snakes cannot hear. They don't have external ears, but they do sense vibrations through their jaw, and it kind of acts the same way that sound waves do in our ears. They can hear through the vibrations coming through their jaws. The next thing is tail autotomy, which we just spoke about, and that's where they can drop their tail as a defense mechanism. A lateral groove is present on lizards. And if you look at the bottom of the eastern glass lizard, at the bottom of that picture, there's like a slight ridge. That's the lateral groove, and that is where their body expands whenever they eat. Snakes expand kind of like a balloon. Their skin will stretch in between their scales. And lizards also have an inflexible jaw, so they cannot expand their jaw the same way that snakes do. Snakes have a flexible jaw. It is not dislocated whenever they open it to eat their prey. It is just very stretchy. It has a very stretchy ligament on the front, and they can expand it to accommodate larger prey and swallow those whole. Lizards chew their food just like we do. So we're going to start talking about the snakes here. So if you feel that you are too fearful to continue, that's understandable, but just know that this is purely educational and I'm not presenting it in a way to cause you any undue stress. We have in Mississippi 45 different species of snakes. If you count subspecies, we actually have up to 55 species of snakes. Of the 45 species, only 6 of those are venomous, where their venom is dangerous to humans. So those are your coral snake, and then your viperidae, your vipers, which are the copperhead, cottonmouth, and the 3 rattlesnakes. There are some types of non-traditional, non-venomous snakes that have a type of venom that is non-harmful to humans. They have something called a Dubournois gland, and those have a like a grooved tooth in their mouth that the venom can kind of go along, and that venom is very specific to whatever prey they are eating. So to give you an example of how mild this is to humans, one of the snakes that has the Dubournois glands are the garter snakes, and as you know, garter snakes are one of the safest snakes that you can handle here, and that's how mild their venom is. So of the colubridae, which make up the other snakes outside of the venomous snakes, there are 23 types that you will likely see in your garden. And we're going to talk about those. So this first group of snakes, I'm just calling them small brown snakes because when you see them, you're going to be like, oh, look at that small brown snake. You may even mistake it for a worm. Some of them, like the common worm snake, do look remarkably like a worm. All of these are great friends to have in your garden because they all control different types of pests. A lot of them are slug specialists, and as all gardeners know, slugs can really mess up your garden. And so the fact that these guys eat those slugs is a very good thing. These are also fossorial snakes, meaning that they live underground, so they will live in the soil of your garden. So sometimes when you're watering your garden, just like when worms come up when it rains, that water might have these make these snakes come up to the surface, so you might see them more often. Um, these are great pest control, and if you can encourage these snakes to stay in your garden, they are a huge benefit. This next group are the ones that most people are familiar with. Those are the garter snake and the ribbon snakes. And these guys eat a little bit larger invertebrates, so they still focus primarily on insects, but they will also eat very small rodents, and occasionally they'll eat other reptiles like your little anole or anole lizards. And the garter snake is actually a semi-aquatic species. And so if your garden is near like a pond or a water source and you're having problems with crawfish that might burrow up through your garden, these garter snakes love to eat crawfish. So they will actually hunt those down and eat them. So again, these are great pest control to have in your garden. To tell these apart, your garter snake has these vertical lines on their jaw. Those are called the labial scales. So they have vertical lines on those labial scales where the ribbon snakes do not. The ribbon snakes have no vertical lines on their jaw, but they do have the white dots right in front of their eye. So that's how you tell the ribbon snake from the garter snake. This next group are the ones that everyone wants in their garden. These are king snakes. King snakes are fantastic because not only do they eat rodents, which are a huge problem for a lot of gardeners, especially if you're growing fruits and vegetables, king snakes will eat other reptiles. So if you are fearful of the venomous species, these king snakes can actually eat the venomous species. They actually prefer to eat reptiles. So their preferred diet is usually your lizards. And if you look at the picture in the top left for of the speckled king snake, it's actually eating one of our eastern glass lizards in that picture. So this next group are just some of the other colubrid species. So the 3 families are Colubridae, Viperidae, and Elapidae. So Colubridae houses pretty much all of the non-venomous species. And of these, 3 of them are rodent specialists. So you have the red corn snake, the gray rat snake, and the black racer. And those guys will help to eat rodents in your garden. The black racer will also eat other snakes, including venomous snakes, just like the king snakes will. You are far more likely to get a zoonotic disease from a rodent than from a snake. So a zoonotic disease is one that transfers from animals to people. So these will help to keep that from happening. They'll also help to keep the rodents from eating your fruits and vegetables that you're trying to grow in your garden. The rough green snake, that last snake there, you won't always see. They are an arboreal species, so they tend to live in higher foliage. But if you do have taller plants in your garden with nice leafy foliage, they will enjoy that. So you may see them every now and then. And they'll also eat grasshoppers and other invertebrates that inhabit the higher areas of your plants. This next group are ones that are just commonly misidentified. So these guys use something called Batesian mimicry, which is a form of mimicry where a non-harmful species will mimic a harmful species in an effort to look more intimidating so that other predators won't mess with them. But in this case of snakes, it actually does not work in their favor when they're around people, because people, not me, but many people will try to kill venomous species, and these guys are commonly mistaken for venomous. The major one is the eastern hognose there in the middle because they can look remarkably like a water moccasin or a copperhead. So these are your venomous species. So these are your 6 venomous ones that we have here in Mississippi. So we have the coral snake, the pygmy rattlesnake, the timber rattlesnake, eastern diamondback rattlesnake, water moccasin, which is also called a cottonmouth, and the copperhead. Um, all of these snakes have venom that is potentially harmful to humans. So we have here the copperhead. This is the one that you will most often see in your garden. It's because these guys prefer a habitat like that. They're not aquatic species, so they like the lower foliage. They are attracted to things that your garden may attract, such as rodents. Whenever they're young, they'll also eat insects. But this is the one that you will most often see in your garden. So to tell this apart from some of your non-harmful species, this is what you look for. Pit vipers, which are all of the vipers that we have here, the rattlesnakes and the 2 Achistrodon, the cottonmouth and the copperhead. They are all called pit vipers because they have a pit that senses heat on the front of their face. So if you look forward of the eye, there is a hole, and that hole is not their nostril. That is a heat sensing pit. Their nostril is actually forward of that, much smaller. If you look at their eye, they have vertical, elliptical cat eye pupils. And these snakes have a distinctive markings, which are those bands. They look like chocolate chips. So if you think of Hershey's chocolate chips, that is what their patterning resembles. And the sides of those chocolate chips are smooth, so they're not like digitized, like sometimes the cottonmouth will be. These also have a triangular head, but you do not want to rely on the triangular head as a distinction for venomous versus non-venomous, because species such as the one here in B, which is a hognose snake, they have the ability to flare their jaw and the ribs right below the head to make their head look triangular, and that is one of those mimicry things where they will look more intimidating. Now, the snake here in C is a corn snake, and whenever they're young and whenever cottonmouth or the copperheads are young, they can look pretty similar. But to tell those apart, you look for those chocolate chip patterns. So the copperhead has the chocolate chips, and the corn snake has blotches. This next one is the coral snake, and you really won't see these very often because they kind of like uh, areas away from human habitation. They like pine woods. They don't like too much noise or anything like that. So you will not always see these in your garden, but if you are near a wooded area or near a pine wooded area in particular, you might see these. You do not want to rely on the old rhyme. They used to say, red on black, venom lack, red on yellow, kill a fellow. That is not accurate, and it is easy to rhyme the wrong things there and get this incorrect. So what they're meaning by that is that there's red, if it's bordered by yellow, that it's venomous. But if you look inside of the red on ours, this is the harlequin coral snake, there is black inside of the red. So if you just say red on black, venom black, then right here you could easily get bitten by a venomous species if you're trying to handle them. All snakes, just like people, individuals can vary and their patterns can vary from one to the next. So sometimes those black spots inside of the red can look more like another band. So the 3 lookalikes here, B, C, and D. B is a scarlet snake, and this one, their numbers are dropping drastically in our state. They used to be prevalent, and they're getting harder and harder to find. So to tell those apart, the red is encircled by black. So it almost looks like there are saddles on their backs. And if you look at the head, the scarlet snake has a red head. The coral snake has black from right behind their eyes all the way through the tip of its snout. And that is on all of the coral snakes here in South Mississippi or in Mississippi in general. None of the lookalikes have that black snout. The snake here in C is the common milk snake. And they're again a mimic, but if you look at their sides, they have red that's ringed with black and then like a creamier color. And it's easy for me to tell the scarlet snake from the milk snake because if you look at the milk snake, they have a white snout. And so to me, it looks like they've been drinking milk. And that's the best way that I can tell those guys apart. And the one in D is a scarlet king snake. So that's a highly beneficial snake. And they don't have the red that's ringed and black. They have bands. So they have red that has loops around their full body. And then on their head, they have a red snout. And these last two are the ones that I get misidentified most often. So I have a lot of people send me pictures to ask for snake ID. And these two are the ones that are most common where people believe they have a venomous species when they don't. So A is a venomous species. So that is our native cottonmouth or water moccasin. And B is a Nerodia. So it's a water snake. And we have a lot of different species of Nerodia, but they all have these same um, basic patterns or basic identifiers to tell them apart from a venomous species. So the first thing you look for is pupil shape. So the venomous cottonmouth has a elliptical pupil like a cat eye, and the non-venomous, the Nerodia, has a round pupil. Um, do not use this to identify all venomous species from non-venomous because the coral snake actually has a round pupil, so you don't want to look just for that. And I also don't encourage you to get so close that you have to look at their pupil to tell if it's venomous or non-venomous. A snake can strike about the third of the length of their body, so you don't want to get so close that you're putting yourself in harm's way. The next thing you look for are the labial scales, just like with the garter snake. The Nerodia have vertical bars on their labial scale, so it almost looks like they have a cheesy smile whenever you look at the sides of their face. The cottonmouth does not have those vertical bars on their labial scales on their top jaw. The next thing you look for is an eye mask. A cottonmouth does have an eye mask. So it starts from right in front of their eye to the base of their jaw. Some people call it the Zorro mask or a superhero mask. It's just a very dark band that runs from just in front of the eye all the way to the base of the jaw. And that will be visible whether they are juveniles or adults. And the last thing you look for is the top of the head. So the cottonmouth here and its cousin, the copperhead, they have a very flat top of their head. It's almost like a military style haircut. And the water snakes have a rounder top of their head. And if you look at them from above, you cannot see the cottonmouth's eyes when looking directly at the top of the head, but you can on the water snakes. So you do not want to rely on head shape to tell these apart because the Nerodia, just like the hognose, they can flare their jaw in those ribs and make their head look triangular. So you don't want to rely on that to say if it's venomous or not. And the other thing is the pattern. With the exception of that eye mask, their patterns change through their lives. So this cottonmouth here in A is a very young species, and so its pattern is distinctive. But as they grow, it gets darker and darker. So an older cottonmouth may be solid black. So what do you do if you have a snake in your garden? First off, if it's a non-venomous species, I would leave it there. If at all possible, just let it be. In most cases, they are going to be a huge benefit for your garden, so you don't want to harm or kill them in any way. But if you are very fearful of snakes and you do not want it in your garden, the best thing that you can do is to give it a gentle directional spray from your water hose. Do not spray the snake directly and make sure that you are not in between the snake and its safest location that it wants to go to. So snakes will take the shortest possible route to get to safety. And if that route is between your legs, it will go between your legs to get to safety. So make sure that you are not between the snake and its safe place whenever you're trying to direct it out of your garden. In most cases, this gentle directional spray will encourage the snake to leave because they do not enjoy that at all. So this is always your first line of defense. If you do commonly see snakes in your garden that are venomous, you should always take precautions when entering your garden. So the first thing that you want to do is check your garden spaces. And you don't want to use just your hands because if you reach down to move a plant, you could accidentally be bitten. So the best thing to use is some sort of pole. I use a snake pole, but you may not have one. So you can use like a broom handle or something like that, a long stick. And you just move the base of your plants around to see if there's anything hiding below. You always want to wear boots and gloves just to keep yourself safe. The most common places where people are accidentally bit when they're not trying to handle a snake is their feet. The most common accidental bite is actually on the hand from people trying to handle the snake. So never try to pick them up is the number one thing. You also might want to keep a hose nearby and to monitor your surroundings while you're gardening because snakes can move. And so even if you don't see one there whenever you begin, they can always move into your area. So if it is a venomous species, never try to pick it up or harm it in any way. That is the way that people get bit by these snakes. So the best thing to do is just give it space. Keep your children and your dogs away from the snake. Usually they will move on of their own free will. If they are not leaving, you can call a wildlife rescue or removal organization and they will come and help you. But do not try to move it yourself. It is very important to know that none of our snakes are considered aggressive species. They're not going to chase you down. They are all, however, defensive. So any snake, whether it is venomous or non-venomous, will protect themselves. So they will curl into that defensive position whenever they feel threatened, and they will try to leave. Like I said, sometimes that is right between your feet. But the best thing that you can do is just give them respect and give them space and let them be a benefit to your garden. If you have any other questions about any of the garden surprises, there is an option to have one of the researchers contact you after you complete the second survey. So if you would like that, just make sure you select that option. Thank you, and I hope you have an excellent time and a great garden experience.